The sterile, recycled air of a Boeing 707 cockpit is a place of immense trust. It's a sanctuary of procedure and professionalism, where two pilots hold 300 souls in their hands. But on a clear Tuesday morning at Los Angeles International Airport, that sanctuary was about to be violated. This isn't a story about a mechanical failure or a sudden storm. It's about a failure of character, a rot of prejudice that threatened to ground a flight before it ever left the gate. It's the story of First Officer Mark Renshaw, a man who believed his seniority gave him the right to choose the color of his colleague's skin, and of Captain Robert Peterson, who taught him a lesson in command and consequence that would echo from the cockpit to the very concrete of the runway. What happened next wasn't just a personnel issue. It was a battle for the soul of the flight deck, and the karma that followed was as swift and turbulent as any jet stream. The sun was a pale, promising wafer in the hazy Los Angeles sky, casting long, distorted shadows of airliners across the sprawling tarmac of LAX. Inside Terminal B, the pre-dawn ballet was in full swing. Gate agents tapped at keyboards with rhythmic precision. Baggage handlers orchestrated their metallic symphony on the apron below, and the low, constant hum of a world in motion filled the air. For Captain Robert Peterson, it was a familiar and comforting chaos. At 58, with more than 25,000 flight hours logged in his book, the airport was more a home to him than his quiet suburban house in Long Beach. His silver-flecked hair was neatly combed. His Global Skyways uniform was impeccably pressed, and his eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, missed nothing. He walked with an economy of movement that spoke of decades spent in confined spaces, his presence radiating a calm, unshakable authority. He greeted the gate agents by name, his voice a low, pleasant baritone, before heading down the jet bridge to his office for the next 11 hours, the cockpit of a Boeing 707-300ER, registration N731GS, bound for London Heathrow. His first officer, Mark Renshaw, was already there, deep into the pre-flight checks. Renshaw, in his late 40s, was the physical opposite of Peterson. Where Peterson was lean and calm, Renshaw was stocky, with a restless energy that often manifested as a brusque, clipped manner of speaking. He was a technically proficient pilot, no one could deny that. He knew the 707 systems inside and out, and could fly an approach in near-zero visibility with unnerving precision. But there was a brittleness to him, a tightly coiled spring of resentment that Peterson had noticed on their previous pairings. Renshaw was a man who felt the world owed him something more than it had delivered. A man who saw every junior pilot not as a colleague to be mentored, but as a competitor clawing at his heels. Morning Bob Renshaw grunted, not looking up from the overhead panel where he was flipping a sequence of guarded switches. Mark Peterson replied, settling his flight bag into its designated spot. He slid into the left-hand seat, the captain's chair, the worn sheepskin cover sighing softly under his weight. The cockpit was alive with the gentle whir of cooling fans and the low chime of systems coming online. Looks like a smooth ride over the pond today. Jetstream is playing nice. For now, Renshaw said, his tone flat. They're forecasting some convection over the North Atlantic later, and cargo's loaded heavy. We'll be watching our fuel burn on the step climbs. Peterson nodded his fingers, dancing across the flight management computer FMC keypad, inputting the flight plan. He appreciated Renshaw's thoroughness, even if his delivery lacked warmth. In this job, competence trumped personality every time. Safety was a religion, and its rituals were checklists, cross-checks, and a shared obsessive attention to detail. "We've got a third on the jump seat today," Peterson said conversationally, his eyes still on the screen. "A trainee on his final line check. Name's David Cole. Good paper on him. Ex-Air Force, flew C-17s out of Travis. Sharp kid, they say." Renshaw stopped what he was doing. The rhythmic click-click of the switches ceased. He slowly turned his head, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "Cole. They put him on Flight 104. The flagship London route. It's his final evaluation. They want to see how he handles a high-density, long-haul environment. Chief Pilot Henderson signed off on it himself. He'll be observing mostly, taking notes, maybe handling a few radio calls over the quiet sectors." Renshaw swiveled back to the panel, his movements now jerky and agitated. "With all due respect, Bob, this isn't a training flight. It's an 11-hour haul with 300 passengers. We don't need a rookie looking over our shoulder getting in the way." Peterson's hands paused on the FMC. He turned to look at his first officer. "He's not a rookie, Mark. He's a highly experienced military transport pilot, transitioning to the civilian world. He's got more heavy jet time than half the first officers on the 737 fleet. This is the final step in a year-long process. He's here to learn, and for us to sign him off." "Military time isn't airline time." Renshaw shot back his voice, a low growl. "They don't understand fuel efficiency, passenger comfort, or the pace of commercial operations. They're just—" He trailed off, searching for the right word, his lip curling in distaste. "Different." Before Peterson could respond, a light rap on the cockpit door interrupted them. A flight attendant, Sarah Jenkins, a cheerful woman in her 30s, poked her head in. "Captain, your third crew member is here. Send him in, Sarah." "Thank you, Peterson," said his gaze still locked on Renshaw, a silent warning in his eyes. David Cole entered the cockpit. He was a tall, athletic man in his early 30s, his brand-new uniform crisp and his tie perfectly knotted. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his eyes bright and alert as he took in the complex array of screens and controls. And he was black. He offered a hand first to Peterson. "Captain Peterson, David Cole. It's an honor to fly with you, sir." Peterson shook his hand firmly. "Welcome aboard, David. Good to have you. This is my first officer, Mark Renshaw." David turned to Renshaw, his hand still extended. "Mr. Renshaw, a pleasure." Renshaw didn't move. He stared at David's outstretched hand for a beat too long, his eyes cold and flat. He gave a curt, dismissive nod and turned back to his checklist, pointedly ignoring the offered handshake. "We're behind schedule. I'm running the exterior inspection." The air in the small cockpit grew thick and heavy. David professionally let his hand drop to his side, his friendly expression tightening just a fraction. He betrayed no other emotion, but the insult hung in the air, as visible as a contrail in a clear sky. Peterson's jaw clenched. He saw the flicker of hurt and weary resignation in David's eyes, before it was replaced by a mask of professionalism. He saw Renshaw's deliberate, calculated act of disrespect. This wasn't about military versus civilian. This wasn't about experience. This was something else entirely. Something ugly and unacceptable. Mark Peterson said, his voice dangerously quiet. A word. But Renshaw was already unbuckling his harness. "No time, Captain. We have a flight to run." He pushed past David without a glance and disappeared out of the cockpit, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. David took a deep breath, his focus shifting to the jump seat he would occupy. He began stowing his gear, his movements precise, refusing to acknowledge the poison that had just been injected into the atmosphere. But Peterson wasn't going to let it go. He was the commander of this aircraft, and that command extended to the conduct of his crew. The pre-flight checks could wait. A line had just been crossed, and he was about to draw it again in permanent ink. The hum of the auxiliary power unit seemed to amplify the suffocating silence in the cockpit. David Cole methodically arranged his charts and headset, his focus a tangible shield against the hostility that had just radiated from the right-hand seat. Captain Peterson watched him for a moment, noting the ramrod straightness of his back, the deliberate way he avoided making eye contact. It was the posture of a man accustomed to navigating unseen minefields, a man who had learned that the best defense was often a quiet, unimpeachable professionalism. Peterson unbuckled his own harness. "Excuse me for a moment, David." He found Renshaw on the ramp, ostensibly conducting the exterior walk-around inspection. But Renshaw wasn't looking at the turbine blades or the landing gear struts. He was staring out at the vast airfield, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders rigid with anger. The scream of a nearby Airbus taking off seemed to mirror the turmoil radiating from him. "Mark, we need to talk," Peterson said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the ambient noise of the airport. Renshaw turned his face a mask of indignation. "What is there to talk about? Bob Henderson sprung this on us. A trainee on the London flagship. It's irresponsible. I'm thinking about safety here. That's my only concern." "Your concern," Peterson said, stepping closer. Forcing Renshaw to meet his gaze seemed to materialize the exact moment David Cole walked through the door. "You refused to shake his hand. You dismissed him. Don't you dare dress that up as a safety concern. I know what I saw." Renshaw's face flushed a deep red. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm focused on my duties. We have a complex flight ahead. I don't have time for hand-holding. This isn't a flying club. This is my command." Mark Peterson's voice dropped, losing its heat and gaining a chilling weight. "And on my flight deck we operate with mutual respect, period. That man in there is a United States Air Force veteran who has landed aircraft heavier than this one in war zones. He has earned his place here. You will treat him with the professional courtesy he is due. Is that understood?" A sneer twisted Renshaw's lips. "Understood. No. I'm not going to pretend this is fine. I've been with Global Skyways for 15 years. I've paid my dues. I have a right to a competent, experienced first officer. I can trust not some diversity hire they're fast-tracking to meet a quota." The words venomous and deliberate struck Peterson with physical force. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a moment of poor judgment. It was a deeply rooted prejudice, ugly and defiant. "A diversity hire," Peterson repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "That's what you see when you look at him. I see someone who hasn't earned his stripes in this airline." Renshaw spat, his voice rising. "I see a risk. And frankly, Bob, I won't fly with him. It's a safety issue. My right as a pilot. I am not comfortable sharing a cockpit with him for 11 hours. It's an unnecessary variable. You can tell Henderson I said so." Peterson stared at him, a profound sense of disappointment washing over him. He had seen arrogance in the cockpit before, and ego and even fear. But this was a naked, unapologetic bigotry he had naively hoped was a relic of a bygone era. Renshaw had just drawn a line not in the sand, but on the solid steel of the flight deck. He had made a declaration, and Peterson, as the captain, had to respond. For a long moment, he was silent, the scream of jet engines filling the space between them. Renshaw seemed to take his silence as hesitation, a sign that his ultimatum was being considered. A flicker of triumph showed in his eyes. Then Peterson spoke, his voice devoid of any emotion except absolute finality. "You're right, Mark. It is a safety issue. An attitudinal problem of this magnitude is a direct threat to crew resource management. A pilot who makes judgments based on skin color instead of skill cannot be trusted to make critical decisions. You have created an unsafe condition." Renshaw's smug expression faltered. "What are you talking about? I'm the one trying to prevent an unsafe condition." "No," Peterson said, shaking his head slowly. "You are the unsafe condition. You have just stated you will refuse a lawful assignment from your commanding officer based on prejudice. You have created a toxic and hostile environment before we've even pushed back from the gate. You have fundamentally failed the most basic tenet of being a professional aviator." Peterson pulled out his phone. "You said you won't fly with him? Fine. Your request is granted." Renshaw's eyes widened in confusion, then in dawning horror as he saw Peterson dial a number. "Wait. Bob, what are you doing?" Peterson turned his back to him slightly, his voice clear and concise into the phone. "Paul. It's Bob Peterson. Flight 104. "Yes, fine, thanks. Listen, I have an issue. First Officer Renshaw has declared himself unfit for duty." "No, not medical. He is refusing to fly with the assigned trainee, citing reasons I deem unprofessional and discriminatory." "That's correct. I need a replacement first officer for the London flight. We are standing by at the gate." "Yes, I understand the delay. Get it done." He hung up. He turned back to Renshaw, whose face had gone from red with anger to a pasty, sickly white. The full implication of what had just happened was crashing down on him. You can't do that," Renshaw stammered. "I didn't say I was unfit. I raised a safety concern. And I, as the pilot in command, have evaluated that concern." Peterson said, his voice like ice. "I have determined the concern is not with the trainee, but with you. Your refusal to fly constitutes a self-declaration that you are not fit to perform your duties as part of this crew. Your presence on my flight deck is now terminated. Go back to the crew room and wait for a call from Chief Pilot Henderson. I will be filing a full report. You're grounding me over this." Renshaw's voice was a mixture of disbelief and fury. "This is my career. I'll fight this." "You do that," Peterson said, his gaze unwavering. "Now get off my ramp." He turned and walked back toward the jet bridge without a backward glance, leaving Renshaw standing alone on the tarmac, the thunderous roar of a departing 747 washing over him like a judgment. He had made his stand, and the ground had crumbled beneath his feet. He was no longer a first officer bound for London. He was just a man in a pilot's uniform, stranded on the concrete, stripped of his authority, and his flight by a captain who refused to compromise on the unwritten laws of the Skyskill character and respect. The walk back into the cockpit was one of the longest of Captain Peterson's career. He had just detonated a grenade in the middle of his own flight operation. The consequences would be immediate and messy. A significant delay, a furious chief pilot, and an entire flight crew thrown into disarray. But as he stepped back into the quiet, climate-controlled world of the 777, and saw David Cole still diligently studying the flight plan, as if nothing was amiss, he knew he had made the only possible choice. David Peterson said, his voice calm and even. David looked up, his expression neutral, but his eyes were questioning. "Yes, Captain." There's been a change of plans. First Officer Renshaw will not be flying with us today. He's been reassigned. We have a replacement on the way. It's going to mean a delay, I'm afraid." He offered no further explanation. He didn't need to. The quiet understanding that passed between the two men was more profound than any detailed account. David simply nodded, a flicker of something surprise, relief, validation, crossing his face, before being replaced once more by stoic professionalism. "I understand, Captain." The news spread through the aircraft like a low-pressure system. Sarah Jenkins, the lead flight attendant, appeared at the cockpit door, her face etched with concern. "Captain, the gate agent just called. They're announcing a 90-minute delay due to a crew scheduling issue. Is everything all right?" Peterson looked at her, then glanced at David and made a decision. The crew deserved to know, at least in part. "Everything is under control, Sarah." First Officer Renshaw was not feeling prepared to meet the operational standards for today's flight. "I made the decision to replace him. I apologize for the disruption this will cause for you and your team." The carefully chosen words, operational standards, were a piece of masterful understatement. Sarah, a veteran of the airline industry, could read between the lines. She had seen the way Renshaw had frozen out the new trainee. She had felt the tension radiating from the flight deck. Her eyes flicked to David, then back to Peterson, and a look of deep respect dawned on her face. "Not a problem, Captain. We'll handle the passengers. You just let us know when we're ready." Meanwhile, Mark Renshaw's walk of shame was a portrait in humiliation. He had to trudge back up the jet bridge past the queuing passengers, who were now looking at their phones and grumbling about the just-announced delay. He had to face the gate agent, who had been informed he was off the flight. He was a man stripped of his purpose, a pilot without a plane. He made it to the sterile, impersonal crew operations room, his keycard feeling foreign in his hand. The place was mostly empty, save for a few pilots from other airlines grabbing coffee. He slumped into a chair, the anger and disbelief churning in his gut. Bob Peterson had torpedoed him. He, a 15-year veteran, had been dressed down and dismissed in favor of a trainee, all because he had stood up for his principles for safety. That's how he framed it in his mind, the narrative already twisting to cast himself as the victim, the martyr. His phone rang, the caller ID flashing, Chief Pilot Henderson. Renshaw took a deep breath and answered, ready to unleash his righteous fury. "Paul, it's Mark. Peterson has completely overstepped his authority." Shut up." Mark Henderson's voice was like gravel and glass. There was no room for discussion. "Just listen. I have Captain Peterson's preliminary report. I have a delayed transatlantic flight with 300 passengers that's going to cost this airline tens of thousands of dollars. And I have a pilot in command, one of my most respected captains, telling me his first officer created a hostile and discriminatory environment and then refused a direct order to fly." "That's not what happened," Renshaw protested. "I raised a valid safety concern about the trainee's experience level." "Don't you insult my intelligence." Mark Henderson's voice was cutting. "Peterson told me what you said. Diversity hire. Is that the term you used? Did you really think that kind of poison was going to fly at global skyways? Did you think it was 1965? Renshaw was silent, his own words now sounding hollow and damning even to himself. "Here's what's going to happen." Henderson continued his tone, leaving no doubt that this was an execution, not a negotiation. "You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. When you get back from what would have been your London layover, you will report to my office at 0800 sharp. You will be assigned to ground duty and simulator instruction indefinitely. You will also be enrolled in mandatory sensitivity and crew resource management training. Your flight status is revoked until a formal review board can convene." And Mark Henderson added, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Pray that's all that happens. If I get even a whiff that you're not taking this with the utmost seriousness, I will personally see to it that your career at this airline is over. Do you understand me?" The click of the phone hanging up was deafening. Ground duty, simulators, sensitivity training. It was the aviation equivalent of being sent back to kindergarten. The humiliation was absolute. Mark Renshaw, a top-tier 707 pilot, would be teaching new hires how to handle engine-out procedures on a computer, while the man he had tried to blackball was at that very moment climbing to 35,000 feet over the Pacific on his way to London. Back on Flight 104, the replacement first officer, a genial pilot named Tom Riley, who had been on standby, arrived and was quickly brought up to speed. The pre-flight checks were completed, the cabin was secured, and 97 minutes behind schedule, the powerful GE-90 engines spooled up with a deep, hungry roar. As they taxied toward the runway, Peterson turned to David. "You see that storm system developing over Nevada on the weather radar? Call up air traffic control and request a 20-degree right turn after departure for weather avoidance." It was a simple task, but it was a gesture. It was an affirmation. David keyed the mic, his voice clear and steady, as he communicated with the tower. He belonged here. As the 707 thundered down the runway and lifted gracefully into the California sky, Peterson felt the tension finally drain from his shoulders. He had made the right call. The flight deck was secure. It was a professional, respectful environment. A sanctuary once more. He had excised the poison, but he had a sinking feeling that the poison hadn't been neutralized. It had just been contained, and sooner or later it would find another way to seep out. For 2 weeks, Mark Renshaw stewed in a bitter broth of his own making. The humiliation of his new reality was a daily torment. Instead of commanding a multi-million-dollar aircraft across oceans, he was relegated to a windowless room, overseeing nervous new-hire pilots as they fumbled through emergency scenarios in the flight simulator. The condescending sympathy from his colleagues was almost worse than open scorn. They knew. The story had ripped through the pilot community, a carefully sanitized version, of course, but the subtext was clear. Renshaw had a problem with the new guy and got grounded for it. His meeting with Chief Pilot Henderson had been a brutal, one-sided affair. Henderson had laid out the terms of his penance with the cold precision of a surgeon. The sensitivity training was non-negotiable. The formal review board would meet in a month. Until then, he was not to set foot in a real aircraft. A man like Mark Renshaw, however, whose ego was as vast and fragile as a desert salt flat, could not internalize this as a personal failing. In his mind, he was not the aggressor. He was the victim. He was a truth-teller, punished by a corporation terrified of its own shadow, a guardian of standards in an age of politically correct compromise. This narrative began to solidify, to harden into a conviction. He wasn't wrong. He was just ahead of his time. One evening, drowning his sorrows in a glass of expensive whiskey at his sterile, lonely apartment, he decided to fight back. He couldn't go through official channels. Henderson had made that clear. But there were other ways to wage a war in the 21st century. He scrolled through his contacts and found a name he hadn't thought of in years: Jeremy Pinter. Pinter had been a middling regional airline pilot a decade ago, before washing out. He'd since reinvented himself online as a self-styled aviation watchdog and independent journalist. He ran a blog and a popular video channel called Cockpit Confidential, which specialized in stoking outrage and conspiracy theories about the airline industry. Pinter peddled a constant stream of content about declining pilot standards, the dangers of diversity initiatives, and alleged cover-ups by the FAA and major carriers. He was a grifter, but he had an audience, a large and loyal one, that distrusted mainstream media and was predisposed to believe the worst about the industry. Renshaw dialed the number. Pinter, the voice on the other end, was raspy, self-important. "Jeremy. It's Mark Renshaw. We flew together at Mesa back in the day." A flicker of recognition. Renshaw. Right. The guy who always polished his own flight boots. "Heard you made it to the big leagues?" "Flying the triple right." "What can I do for you?" "Ki'u." Renshaw took a deep breath. "I've got a story for you, Jeremy. A big one. About what's really happening at global skyways. About how they're putting passengers at risk to check boxes. And about what happens to veteran pilots who dare to speak up about it." Pinter's interest was instantly piqued. This was the red meat his audience craved. "I'm listening." For the next hour, Renshaw spun his tale. He was careful, calculated. He never once mentioned race explicitly. That would be too crude, too easily dismissed. Instead, he framed everything in the language of safety and standards. He spoke of a trainee pilot who was being dangerously fast-tracked. He mentioned the trainee's unconventional background, hinting that his military experience was not applicable and that he lacked fundamental commercial aviation skills. He painted David Cole not as a person, but as a symbol of a decline in quality. He then portrayed himself as the lone voice of reason. He claimed, discreetly raised legitimate safety concerns about the trainee's readiness for such a high-stakes flight. And for his diligence, he was summarily removed from duty by a captain eager to toe the company line, and an airline management obsessed with optics over safety. They're grounding experienced pilots for asking questions, Renshaw said, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. They are silencing us. If the flying public knew what was going on, they'd be terrified. Pinter was practically salivating. "This is dynamite, Mark. Can you give me any documentation?" "Training records." "Anything I can't?" Renshaw lied smoothly. "It's all sealed. They're covering it up. But I was there. I'm your source. You can report it as coming from a senior 707 pilot at a major U.S. airline who wishes to remain anonymous to protect his career." 2 days later, the story dropped. Pinter's blog post was titled, "Exclusive Woke Skies." Major airline grounds, veteran pilot for questioning unqualified trainee. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation and inflammatory rhetoric. It was filled with phrases like lowered standards, ticking time bomb, and safety takes a back seat to social engineering. It didn't name Renshaw, Peterson, or David Cole, but it provided just enough detail: the flight from LAX to London, the Boeing 707. The ex-military trainee, that anyone inside the company would know exactly what flight it was about. The article was accompanied by a video where Pinter, looking gravely into the camera, spoke of a cancer of incompetence spreading through the industry, all thanks to misguided diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. The story exploded in the echo chamber of the internet. It was shared thousands of times on social media. It was picked up by other blogs and commentators who amplified Pinter's message. The comments sections were a cesspool of outrage and paranoia. Global Skyways was inundated with messages from angry customers demanding to know if their flights were being operated by unqualified quota pilots. The poison Renshaw had tried to inject into one cockpit was now seeping into the public consciousness. He had successfully reframed his personal prejudice as a public safety crusade. Watching the digital firestorm ignite from the safety of his apartment, a grim smile touched his lips. He hadn't just fought back. He had changed the entire battlefield. Now it wasn't just his word against Captain Peterson's. It was one lone, brave pilot against a monolithic, corrupt corporation. At least that's how it would seem to the world. The digital wildfire, started by Jeremy Pinter's blog post, quickly became a full-blown corporate crisis for Global Skyways. The PR department worked overtime issuing carefully worded statements about their rigorous training standards and unwavering commitment to safety. But the anonymous, insidious nature of the accusation was hard to fight. It was a phantom menace, and it was doing real damage to the airline's reputation. The pressure flowed downhill, landing squarely on Chief Pilot Henderson's desk. The board wanted answers. They wanted the situation contained. Henderson, a man who despised public relations crises almost as much as he despised bigotry in his pilot ranks, knew he had to act decisively. The informal administrative leave for Renshaw was no longer sufficient. This required a full, formal, by-the-book internal investigation. Captain Peterson was called in first. He sat opposite Henderson and two stone-faced representatives from the airline's legal and HR departments. He recounted the events of that morning on the ramp at LAX with meticulous, dispassionate detail. He repeated Renshaw's exact words, including the damning phrase, "diversity hire." "And in your professional opinion, Captain," one of the lawyers asked, "did this trainee, Mr. Cole, exhibit any behavior or lack of knowledge that would constitute a safety risk?" "Absolutely not," Peterson stated firmly. His performance for the remainder of the flight to London and back was exemplary. He was professional, knowledgeable, and calm under pressure. He handled radio communications through some of the most congested airspace in the world without a single misstep. The only safety risk present on that day was First Officer Renshaw's attitude, which destroyed the principles of crew resource management before we ever left the ground. Peterson left the meeting feeling confident in his actions, but deeply troubled by the ordeal. He was a pilot, not a politician. He hated that his flight deck had become the epicenter of a public controversy. He worried about the effect this was having on the one person who was truly innocent in all of this, David Cole. David was trying his best to ignore the storm. He continued with his training, determined not to let the controversy derail the dream he had worked his entire life to achieve. But it was impossible. The whispers followed him down the hallways of the training center. He saw the sideways glances from other pilots, the sudden silences when he entered a room. He didn't know for sure that Pinter's article was about him, but he knew. Every pilot at Global Skyways knew. He was no longer just David Cole, a promising new hire. He was now a symbol. To some, he was the faceless, unqualified trainee from the blog post. To others, he was a victim of ugly prejudice. Neither label felt like him. He was just a pilot who wanted to fly. The pressure began to take its toll. The joy he once felt in the simulator was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Every minor mistake, every slightly off-kilter approach felt magnified 1,000 times. He imagined a room full of anonymous internet commentators judging his every move. He started second-guessing himself, his natural confidence eroding under the weight of the invisible scrutiny. The investigation required him to give a formal statement. Sitting in the same sterile conference room Peterson had occupied, David recounted his version of events. He was factual and avoided emotive language. He spoke of Renshaw's refusal to shake his hand, the tense atmosphere, and his dismissal from the cockpit. He spoke with the same quiet dignity he had shown on the day of the incident. Mr. Cole, the HR representative, asked gently, "How has this incident and the subsequent public speculation affected you?" David hesitated, the professional mask he wore so well threatening to crack. "I've spent my entire adult life serving my country and learning to be the best pilot I can be," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I have over 4,000 hours in heavy multi-engine jets. I've landed in places with no runway lights, in sandstorms, with hostile threats on the ground. All I've ever wanted was to be judged on my skill, on my performance. This," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly, "this makes you feel like none of that matters. It makes you feel like the first thing people see. The only thing some people see is the color of your skin. It's exhausting." His words hung in the air, a testament to the real human cost of Renshaw's calculated campaign. This wasn't just a corporate headache or a PR problem. This was a direct assault on a good man's career and spirit. Henderson and his team now had a clear picture. But it was still a he said situation, albeit one where the he on one side was a highly respected captain and a decorated veteran, and on the other was a first officer with a history of being difficult. Renshaw, through his anonymous leaking, had cleverly created a public narrative that protected him. He was hiding behind the shield of anonymous sources. The airline knew he was the source, but proving it was another matter. To fire Renshaw, they needed more. They needed something incontrovertible, something that would not only justify his termination, but would also completely discredit the public safety narrative he had so maliciously constructed. The investigative team was tasked with digging into every corner of Mark Renshaw's professional life. They pulled his entire 15-year file, every performance review, every simulator check ride report, every note and every single complaint, no matter how minor or long forgotten. They were looking for a pattern. And slowly, painstakingly, a pattern began to emerge. While the formal investigation delved into his past, Mark Renshaw was living out his humiliating present. His ground duty assignment was not merely teaching in the high-tech simulators. It included a rotation through flight operations, the nerve center of the airline. Here he was tasked with menial but critical jobs normally handled by junior staff or dispatchers. One of these jobs was assisting with weight and balance calculations for cargo flights, complex spreadsheets of data that determined how cargo pallets were to be loaded to ensure the aircraft remained stable. It was soul-crushing work for a man who saw himself as a master of the skies. He performed his duties with a sullen, distracted air. His mind wasn't on the cargo manifests or the center of gravity envelopes. It was on his phone, obsessively tracking the performance of Jeremy Pinter's article, reading the comments, and soaking in the validation from anonymous strangers who hailed him as a hero. His bitterness was a constant low-grade fever, clouding his judgment and dulling his famed attention to detail. On a sweltering Thursday afternoon, a priority request came through. A Global Skyways Cargo 747 Flight 2180 to Anchorage had a last-minute cargo switch. Several heavy pallets of dense machinery had been added. The loadmaster on the ramp needed a revised load plan immediately to meet their departure slot. The dispatcher on duty was swamped, so he handed the manifest to Renshaw. "Mark, can you run the numbers on this? Just a standard retrim." Renshaw took the paperwork with a resentful sigh. This was work for an intern. He punched the new weights and positions into the planning software, his fingers moving quickly, his mind elsewhere. He glanced at the final numbers, saw the center of gravity was within limits barely, and signed off on the trim sheet. He passed it back to the dispatcher, who, seeing Renshaw's signature and trusting his experience as a senior pilot, relayed the loading instructions to the ramp without a second glance. What Renshaw's distracted mind had missed was a crucial note on the manifest. The new machinery pallets had a non-standard footprint, requiring them to be placed further aft than the software's default position. The small change, a matter of a few feet, had a massive effect on the aircraft's balance. His calculation wasn't just slightly off, it was dangerously wrong. The 747's center of gravity would be far too close to the aft limit. While it might take off, it would be unstable, difficult to control, and at risk of a catastrophic stall, especially if it encountered turbulence. The loadmaster on the ramp, a meticulous veteran named George Finney, got the new instructions. As his team began moving the pallets, something felt wrong to him. He'd loaded thousands of 747s, and this configuration just didn't look right. The tail of the massive plane seemed to be sitting lower than it should. Trusting his gut, he put a hold on the loading and called flight operations. "Hey dispatch, it's George on the ramp for 2180. Can you double-check that trim sheet for me? This load feels tail-heavy." The dispatcher, prompted by George's concern, pulled up Renshaw's worksheet and ran the numbers again, this time noticing the note about the non-standard pallets. He entered the correct position. The computer flashed a bright red warning: AFT CG limit exceeded. No takeoff. A cold dread washed over the dispatcher. He immediately called the ramp. "George, stop everything. Do not close the doors. The trim sheet is wrong. It's a no-go." He then walked over to where Renshaw was sullenly reading an operations manual, the faulty trim sheet in his hand. "Mark," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "your calculation for 2180 was dangerously out of limits. You nearly put a 747 in the air in an unstable configuration." Renshaw snatched the paper, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw the red warning on the dispatcher's screen. It was a rookie mistake, a monumental career-ending blunder, and he, the self-proclaimed guardian of safety, had made it while performing a basic ground task. There was no trainee to blame, no captain to argue with. There was only his own negligence. Simultaneously, in the corporate offices, the investigative team had found their pattern. Renshaw's file was littered with minor, previously unconnected incidents. A 2018 complaint from a female first officer about his condescending and dismissive attitude. A 2020 note from a junior flight attendant of Asian descent mentioning Renshaw's inappropriate jokes. A 2022 simulator report where the instructor noted Renshaw showed significant difficulty in accepting input from his junior crew member during a simulated emergency. Viewed in isolation over 15 years, they were explainable. But viewed together in the context of the incident with David Cole, they painted a clear and damning portrait of a man with a persistent authority. Problem, particularly with crew members who didn't look like him or fit his narrow conception of what a pilot should be. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. The airline's IT security team, tasked with monitoring for leaks, had cross-referenced phone records from the day of Pinter's blog post. They found a 1-hour call made from Renshaw's personal cell phone to Jeremy Pinter's number 2 days before the article was published. It was the smoking gun. They had him. Just as the investigative team was compiling their final report, the incident report from the cargo ramp landed on Henderson's desk. It was the nail in Renshaw's coffin. Henderson read the report from flight operations, his face grim. The irony was staggering. The man who had grounded himself claiming a trainee was a safety risk had, through his own bitterness and distraction, committed a safety violation so grievous it could have led to the loss of an aircraft and its crew. His public crusade for standards was a fraud exposed not by a complex investigation, but by a simple math error born of pure arrogance. The hard karma Renshaw had set in motion had finally circled back, and its impact was about to be devastating. The summons to Chief Pilot Henderson's office felt different this time. There was an air of finality to it. Mark Renshaw walked down the corridor, the ghost of his career trailing behind him. The news of his cargo calculation error had spread like wildfire, dousing the last embers of his credibility. The whispers in the hallway were no longer speculative. They were definitive. He was done. He entered the office to find Henderson was not alone. The same two representatives from legal and HR were present, their expressions as impassive as granite. A thick file folder sat on the polished table between them. It was his file. His entire professional life reduced to paper and ink. "Mark, sit down." Henderson said, his voice flat, devoid of the anger from their previous encounter. This was no longer a dressing down. It was a formality. Henderson slid the file across the table. "We have completed our investigation. We have found a clear and persistent pattern of unprofessional conduct, of creating a hostile work environment, and of demonstrating poor crew resource management. We have multiple documented instances culminating in your discriminatory actions toward trainee pilot David Cole on the morning of the flight to London." He paused, letting the weight of the word settle. Ordinarily, that alone would be grounds for severe disciplinary action. However, you chose to escalate the situation. He slid a printout of the call log across the table, showing the highlighted call to Jeremy Pinter. You leaked a deliberately false and misleading narrative to an online blogger, causing significant reputational damage to this airline and unjustly maligning an excellent young pilot. You knowingly created a public safety scare based on a lie, all to settle a personal grudge. Renshaw stared at the call log, his last line of defense crumbling to dust. He had no words, no arguments left. And then Henderson continued, his voice dropping. "There is the matter of Flight 2180. He pushed the cargo incident report next to the call log. "While waging your public campaign about being a guardian of aviation safety, you yourself committed an act of gross negligence. You signed off on a dangerously incorrect weight and balance sheet that could have resulted in a catastrophic accident. It was only caught by the diligence of a loadmaster on the ramp. Your supposed commitment to safety is a complete and utter fraud, Mark. You are not a guardian of our standards. You are a liability to them." Henderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "Effective immediately, your employment with Global Skyways is terminated for cause. We will be submitting a full report of the cargo incident to the Federal Aviation Administration. I imagine they will take a very keen interest in reviewing your pilot certificate." Termination. The word hit Renshaw with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just being fired. The report to the FAA meant his entire career at any airline was likely over. No carrier would touch a pilot whose certificate was under review for such a grievous safety breach, especially one tied to such a public display of poor judgment. He was grounded. Permanently. Not by a captain defending his crew, but by his own hand. He had tried to ground a man for the color of his skin, and in the end, he had grounded himself through the darkness of his own character. Months later, the early morning sun once again cast long shadows across the tarmac at LAX. At the gate for Flight 104 to London, the atmosphere in the cockpit of the Boeing 777 was starkly different. Captain Robert Peterson sat in the left seat, sipping his coffee, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. A light rap on the door, and his first officer entered. David Cole, now fully certified, and no longer a trainee, moved with an easy confidence. The brand-new look of his uniform had been replaced by the comfortable wear of a seasoned professional. The anxiety that had haunted him during the investigation was gone, replaced by the calm focus of a pilot at home in his element. Morning Bob David said, a genuine smile on his face as he settled into the right-hand seat. Morning. David Peterson replied. Weather looks good all the way across. Should be a beautiful flight. They began their pre-flight flow, a seamless partnership of checks and balances. Their communication was crisp, efficient, and respectful. It was the quiet, professional harmony that every cockpit strives for. As they prepared for takeoff, David looked out at the sprawling airport, at the other metal birds waiting to take flight. He had weathered the storm. He had faced down the ugly prejudice and had refused to let it define him or derail him. He had won, not by fighting back with anger, but by simply being excellent at his job. As the powerful engine spooled to life, pushing him back into his seat, he felt the thrill he had always felt, the pure joy of flight. He was no longer a symbol, no longer a headline. He was just a pilot in his rightful place, soaring into the endless blue sky, leaving the bitterness and the hatred of one man far, far below on the ground. The story of Mark Renshaw is a powerful real-world reminder that in any profession, but especially one built on trust and teamwork, character is as critical as skill. His prejudice was not just a personal failing, it was a professional one that led directly to his downfall. He tried to build a wall around his career using the bricks of intolerance, only to find he had built his own prison. On the other hand, Captain Peterson's decisive leadership and David Cole's unwavering professionalism show us the immense power of integrity. They proved that a culture of respect isn't just a nice idea. It's a fundamental component of safety and excellence. The cockpit of Flight 104 became a crucible where the best and worst of human nature were on display, and thankfully the best won out. If this story resonated with you, please help us share these important messages by hitting that like button. Consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next real-life drama. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, made all the difference? Thank you for listening.